Welcome to Our National Conversation, a podcast in which we discuss politics from all angles. We are completely nonpartisan, and all views, respectfully stated, are welcome here. Our podcast is unique in that it is hosted and run by students who are focused on finding solutions to the biggest problems facing America.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Sam Taylor. I'm the managing editor at Our National Conversation, and you're listening to Allow Us to Explain. On today's episode, we're going to be discussing student loan forgiveness. I'm joined here today by Richard Vedder. Richard, if you'd like to introduce yourself, kind of some of your qualifications, your experience with this topic in particular.
Yeah, sure. I'm glad to be with you, Sam. I am a retired professor who was been teaching since, I'm guessing, your age, about since you were minus 35 or minus 45. I started teaching. I've been teaching since 1965 at Ohio University, a state university in Ohio. My title is Distinguished Professor of Economics Emeritus. I've written a number of books on a whole variety of topics. I won't bore your audience with the ones that are not too relevant to today's discussion. Relevant to today's discussion, I guess, I served on the Spellings Commission on the Future of Higher Education, which was a major federal commission. It was big in the first decade of this century, around 2005. It was the biggest thing going, how should we reform higher ed and all. I was a member of that. I was appointed by the White House to serve on that. I served as, I ran a center on college affordability and productivity for a number of years. I've written a book. I wrote one book called Going Broke by Degree, Why Colleges Cost Too Much. I wrote another book called Restoring the Promise, Higher Education in America. And I'm writing a third book. In fact, I finished writing it. It hasn't been published yet, on creative destruction in higher education. So I'm doing a lot of work in higher ed, as well as my earlier work in a variety of fields. I have worked for the U.S. Congress. I have done a lot of public policy work as well.
Thank you so much. I'm sure we're all going to be very interested to hear what you have to say on this topic. So moving forward, my first question, well, I suppose before we get to that, just a little bit of background on the topic for our audience. So as of August 2023, Americans owe $1.77 trillion in student debt. Now, many believe forgiving these loans is kind of a remedy to the issue. Some who support loan forgiveness say forgiving student loan debt will provide further socioeconomic mobility to students and recent graduates. Others say taxpayers shouldn't have to pay student loans that either they, have never engaged in college in the past, or they've never, they already have their student loans paid off, and that they shouldn't be responsible for paying other people's student loans for the future. So I'm just curious, in a very broad sense, do you think student loans should be forgiven?
A one-word answer, no. There's a more complicated answer always, and there's a case for some forgiveness for some people and maybe not for others. But the broad answer to your question is I'm a skeptic on the whole topic of student loan forgiveness. It might be interesting to your listeners or viewers to review the history, the federal government's whole history in that area for a minute or two, if that's all right, how we got to where we are now, as it were. Before 1944, the federal government did absolutely nothing, and I mean nothing, in terms of any sort of support of students at all. It was during World War II we passed what became popularly known as the GI Bill. And then in the late 1950s, the Cold War is going on, and Russia had launched Sputnik, and everyone was excited. the Russians are taking over, the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. And so we need to do something about that. So we passed the National Defense Education Act, which was to provide support mainly in the STEM disciplines, scientific areas, math and so on, for students who are getting graduate degrees. So that was in the late 50s. Then a decade later, in the 60s, I'm gradually going to get to the present, we had the Higher Education Act of 1965, which still exists. It's been modified a lot since, which started the concept of providing federal financial assistance to students. And that grew enormously in the late 1970s, which is also the same time that we created the U.S. Department of Education. So that's how the whole thing came about. When the program started, the student financial forgiveness loan programs, and even the Pell Grant programs, the actual granting of monies, scholarship money, if you like, to students, the idea was that we want to help lower income people of lesser means to go to college. We want to improve college access. And so the issue is, has that worked? And I would argue that it hasn't worked as anticipated. There's something called the law of unintended consequences. What the colleges did, they said, aha, these kids can borrow money now. We can rip. They didn't say we can rip them off. They said we can take advantage of this situation to improve our college opportunities, or some such language. And so they raised tuition fees. And there's a lot of good empirical evidence from, for example, the New York Federal Reserve Bank, that for every dollar of new aid given to students by the federal government, say in the form of student loans, colleges then will raise their tuition fees to get about 2/3 of it. They don't get all, but they get most of it. So the student doesn't. The big gainers of student loan programs haven't been the students, but people like me. You know, I want to take a second trip overseas this year. I need a little more money, so I'll get. So they raise fees, tuition fees go up. Colleges have more money to spend. They hire more administrators. They give faculty a little more money, more sabbatical leaves, and all sorts of perks that we get as professors that we're not supposed to talk about, but it's true, we get them. It's just, I'm retired, so I can say anything I want. So that's what happened. So the program begins, and at the time the programs began, about 10-12% of recent college graduates were in the bottom quarter of the income distribution. That proportion today is probably about the same. There has been no significant gain in the percentage of college students who are really poor. There's, the absolute number has grown because enrollments have grown over time, population has grown, but we haven't had that goal of equal opportunity for all has not been really well achieved, in my opinion. I think the empirical evidence is pretty clear on that. There's not even too much disagreement on that, I don't think. I mean, the evidence is clear. So then we started the student loans. As you say, it was small. Now it's $1.75 trillion, roughly, rounding it off. You divide that by 40-some million people who have current student loan obligations. That averages out $30-some thousand a person. That's an average. And for those people who know a little bit about statistics, averages are useful statistics, but they can be deceiving as well. If you look at the median, that's sort of the middle figure, right in the middle, you get a number much lower than 30-some thousand. The reason is we have a number of especially grad students and professional students who have these huge debts. I mean, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 debts. And so they raise the average quite a bit. So a more typical student debt these days is more like $20,000 or so, which is far from inconsequential, but it is not quite as high as those average figures suggest. So that's a little sort of background. I'm sorry, I've been talking too long, Sam, and that's, as I told you, that's an occupational affliction of college professors. So
no problem at all. I mean, just hearing your thoughts on this issue is, of course, why we're here. I think as you were speaking, a question that kind of came to my mind is, I wonder if maybe, some regulation could be introduced at some level of government to maybe prevent some of the artificial price raising that we're seeing in universities. Do you think that this could be an appropriate response? Would this not be feasible? Could it potentially create more problems than solutions?
You're asking exactly the right question, and at times I've said, yeah, that's what we need, are price controls in effect on what the universities can do. The deal would be, if you want to have your students participate in the student loan programs, you have to agree to follow these certain rules. I do think there are some things that could be done that would help deal with the problem. One idea that has gotten quite a bit of attention is making the colleges have some skin in the game, to use a popular term. Make the colleges face negative consequences themselves if you get an awful lot of students who borrow money and then simply don't pay back. In other words, if this debt problem is because there are certain colleges where you get enormous amounts of loans that are simply not paid off, then maybe those colleges are partly at fault for accepting, maybe in some cases, for accepting students they know have no likely prospect of graduating. The colleges want the students for their tuition money. They get the tuition money. They flunk the kids out. The federal government gets the bill to pay for all this. Maybe the colleges themselves should pay. So that's an idea that has gotten some support. It's I think it's a relatively nonpartisan idea. I mean, Republicans and Democrats and independents can see some logic in that approach. So there are some ideas out there that would change the dynamics a bit. That's not the only idea. That's just one that I've heard that is popular, and it avoids the problem that you mentioned at the beginning when you said that some opponents of loan forgiveness point out that maybe it's unfair to give students a special deal. You don't have to pay your deal. When if you were, say, a 20-year-old who wanted with a high school diploma and you want to go into the auto repair business and you want $50,000 to start an auto repair shop, the federal government won't give you that money. And if they did give you the money, they would insist you pay it back. They wouldn't say, "Oh, you will forgive the loan." So people outside the higher ed sector, the rest of the population, feel, some of them, that us college people, and I put you and me, we're two generations apart, but we're in the same group of people. We're all part of the college community, university community. They feel, you people think you're special. And, so there's a lot of sort of blue collar resentment, I think we'll call it, for lack of I don't know what the right term is, to the forgiveness programs that some people just think they're unfair. And so things like skin in the game, which is one idea, there are others, where the colleges face some consequences themselves, is an idea whose time may have come. And so as a way of dealing with this problem. Also, there's some people who borrow in the student loan program. Some people say, maybe we shouldn't allow these kind of loans, or maybe we should restrict them, be more strict. Some loans are different than others. A person who borrows $150,000 to get an MBA from Harvard may be in a different category than someone who's a major in French no one majors in French anymore, do they? But c'est dommage. I'll speak. I can speak French, so but I won't. So maybe we ought to have some favor certain types of student loans over others, and maybe we shouldn't let people who are going to get graduate degrees so they can go make $200,000 a year out of $150,000 a year right away. Those I'm picking on Harvard MBAs, or it could be MBAs from any school, a Master of Business Administration degree. Maybe those kind of loans ought to be treated different than those getting a bachelor's degree in fine arts at Brigham Young University or University of Maryland or whatever school you want to pick. So I do think we ought to be rethinking who we give loans to and so on. We also have a category of loans called push loans, which are loans made to the parents of students in some circumstances. And there's been a lot of, and I'm not an expert on this topic, but there has been a lot of pushback on what is the appropriateness of making loans to parents of students. It's one thing to make loans to students, but why their parents? Why, So we could restrict the category of loans a bit. And in doing that, we would change the dynamics of the size of the debt and so forth, and reduce the need for loan forgiveness. Even if we're going to do it, it would become a smaller pile. It would be a lesser amount. When you're talking $1.75 trillion, you're talking real money, even in these days and age. And our nation, the Standard & Poor's and Moody's, the people who look at our U.S. debt, the federal government, are downgrading the United States debt. That's the money, the bonds, the people who the U.S. government goes out and borrows money to finance all these activities, including student loan forgiveness. And they're saying, hey, the U.S. is living beyond its means. We're spending more than we're taking in. We've been doing that. We haven't balanced our budget in 23 years as a nation. How in the heck can the U.S. go out and lend, money? Some politicians will say those spoiled college kids, and who spend all their time drinking and fornicating and doing all sorts of things they shouldn't be doing. And why are we lending them money? It just doesn't make sense. So there's that school of thought too.
One thing that I think you touched on a little bit is how should we restrict any loan relief plans that we implement? So the U.S. Department of Education did actually release a draft of new federal rules narrowing the student loan relief plan. They narrowed it to 4 specific groups. Those specifically borrowers whose balances exceed what they originally owed, as one group. Those who have loans that entered repayment 25 or more years ago. Those who used loans to attend career training programs that led to quote unquote unreasonable debt loads or insufficient earnings. And then those who are eligible for loan forgiveness programs but did not apply. Based on what you've said, do you think that this is at least a step in the right direction, this sort of restriction? Do you think these groups maybe warrant some loan forgiveness, or do you think that there's some error in the government's approach here?
Well, I think the approach is a sound one. I mean, I think it's fine and sensible and desirable even to accept the fact that not all borrowers are the same, that they differ, and some of them may have more legitimate reasons for having debt or acquired under more reasonable circumstances, etc. And it might be wise to do this kind of, okay, let's treat each category a little bit differently. And the categories that you named sound to me like reasonable ones for the most part. Now, people who have a greater debt now than what they borrowed got to that point of view because they didn't pay off their debt. And in some cases, they may have been poverty stricken and they may have been unable to become employed. There may be a lot of sort of let's call it legitimate reasons for this, but there may be other cases. And I actually have to admit, I know some people in this second category who have enjoyed pretty much the good life. They kind of take the view, well, these student loans, I can get away with not repaying them. The interest on them is pretty low. It's not 10% or 15%. It's less than credit card interest rates, maybe 5% or 6%. So my $30,000 debt will go up by $2,000 next year. Big whoop. I want to go to Europe, and I don't have, or I want to buy a house, or I want to get married. Any of a whole variety of things that young people want to do and should do, by the way. Therefore, I'll just not pay the debt. That if it had been a private company making the loan, a bank, for example, they would be on you if you didn't pay it. They would come, they would go to court, they would seize your assets, they would, do all kinds of nasty things to you to get that money back. But the federal government says, we're easy, we don't do those kind of things. Well, probably the federal government should be a little harsher than it has been with borrowers. But on the other hand, there are some occasional special circumstances where forgiveness may be legitimate, particularly where you have things like people who have disabilities, during the course of their work life, and that keep them from working, and things of that nature. Clearly, those are special cases that deserve consideration. My only criticism is I think we've gone too far in that, and that we want to offer forgiveness to almost anyone and everyone. The federal government also, for some reason, has an ideological, I don't know, maybe I'm going to get in trouble for saying that, an ideological dislike of private for-profit lenders. That category has been particularly, the government has tried to put them out of business, in my opinion. And they've done a pretty good job of it, by the way. And they have particularly scrutinized that sector and made forgiveness in that area. In some cases, maybe legitimately. There's some bad actors in that sector. I'm not denying that. But that sector has gotten special attention from the Biden administration and earlier administrations as well, but particularly the Biden administration seems to be gung-ho on giving forgiveness to various institutions, higher education institutions that have been associated at one time or other with the for-profit higher ed sector.
Yeah, I do definitely think, like, I can see the obviously the potential problem with kind of just almost treating these students, people who are in these loans, with a massive brush strokes that ignore individual cases. Of course, I suppose the main issue, and this might be levied especially by people who adopt a more libertarian stance, is just a general distrust of the government's ability to properly vet a lot of those individual cases and to, maybe apply a proper formula, just really mechanically, as the government tends to do with these larger issues, it seems to me, and not let people either slip through or impose certain student loans on people who might deserve forgiveness, while allowing those who maybe don't to actually receive that forgiveness. That sort of inefficiency it's something that you hear a lot with respect to the welfare state, other sorts of government issues. I mean, whenever the government's really getting involved in sorts of like social spending and that type of arena. So I'm just curious, based on your experience working in past, obviously, committees and advisory roles and so forth, what do you feel is really the government's ability to vet these cases. Do you think it has the capacity to do so properly, either on a federal level, a state level?
Well, my own feeling, you asked me, so I'll answer. And by the way, I've worked personally with 3 or 4 secretaries of education over the years. I mean, known them. I was asked by one secretary of education to help simplify the FAFSA form, which was 130 some questions long. That request was made to me 16 years ago, and the form is still impossible. They hope to simplify it by next year. The federal government is notoriously inefficient, and partly by safeguards put in to protect the democratic processes and so on. It's not altogether for bad reasons, but the federal government is not terribly effective in doing things quickly, rationally, and so forth. And so you mentioned libertarian way of looking at things. In passing, you mentioned there's a libertarian perspective on it. What libertarians might call for is to get the federal government out of the student loan business. And the first retort to that is, well, how are kids going to pay for college if the federal government gets out of the business? And the answer might be, maybe we ought to move to something called income share agreements, which exist on a very minor level already, where kids are in effect sell stock in themselves, sell part of their earnings for the next 10, 15, X number of years to a benefit. We call it not really a benefactor, an investor who pays for their college or part of their college, and you make a deal with it. If you say to the investor, if you pay for my college, or let's say $50,000 towards my college over the next 4 years, I'll give you 10% of my earnings for the first 10 years out of college, or something like that. That's kind of what we did in the colonial period when we brought people to America that were indentured servants. They came to America and someone paid for their voyage across the Atlantic, which was very expensive in those days, and so we'll pay to get you to America, and we'll get you started, and you'll work for next to nothing. You'll be given room and board and just enough to live, but we'll exploit the hell out of you, excuse my language, for the next 7 years. And then by doing that, you're repaying us for the passage costs. Well, indentured servitude has is a pejorative term that's viewed negatively today, but it had its virtues. It got a lot of people to America, got our nation started. And maybe we ought to be doing something kind of like that with college. You can go to college. We'll pay $50,000, but you got to pay us back. And we're private sector people. We're going to come after you if you don't pay us back. We'll come and we'll take your car away from you, or your dog away from you, your girlfriend away from you. We'll do everything we can to make life miserable for you until you pay us back. So that's an idea that's actually starting to catch on. Purdue University is doing a little bit of experimenting with that approach to using some of its own resources to make deals with students like this. We'll invest in you because we believe you're productive potentially, and it's kind of an interesting. In other words, there are other ways of financing college other than what we're doing now that maybe we ought to at least be exploring and experimenting with, and what have you. So I throw that out.
No, I think that at least looking at alternatives is a good thing. Now, maybe some people might be kind of just like, before any discussion, very turned off by the idea, just because, if there's any even tacit relation or resemblance to something like indentured servitude, then that's going to have very negative connotation there. You can already start to see the contours of a pretty avid debate beginning to appear there. But yeah, maybe some degree of private involvement, so long as there are certain, degrees of regulation that prevent exploitation or abuse. I think is a potentially reasonable measure. As far as whether it's a better measure or not, I certainly don't have the expertise to try to determine one or the other, but I'd very much like to hear more from obviously both perspectives on that. But I guess that degree of private involvement isn't something I've really thoroughly heard before. So that is interesting.
It's not going to happen in the very short run.
Mhm.
First of all, we're entering a presidential election year. Nothing happens in a presidential election year much. Don't tell the people in DC that, but I used to work for Congress, by the way, so I'm not a total novice in this area. Nothing big is going to happen in the next year, other than we're going to decide who's the nominees for president from both of the major parties, and we'll be fighting election battles, and everyone's going to be concentrating on that. And Congress is not going to put a lot of attention into this issue, in my opinion. Now, and this gets a little off the topic, but it's still on the topic. The political environment for helping colleges and helping college kids has deteriorated in recent years. There is more and more lack of public support for what colleges are doing. That isn't necessarily a lack of support for the kids that are going to college, but it doesn't improve the political environment in which decision making is happening. So you're going to have an awfully tough time, when you dealing with this, when you get billionaires, and there are a lot of them who are withdrawing large gifts from the major Ivy League schools, for example, $25 million gifts over various issues, including, of course, the current problems in the Middle East and the Hamas-Israeli dispute. So all of this creates a political environment which makes it difficult to do much in this area that's radical. Now, what the Biden administration is trying to do is to get around that and say, well, we'll just do it. We'll just hell with it. Well, the hell with the public. Some would say the hell with the Constitution. We'll just do it. We'll forgive this group. We'll forgive that group. We'll put in income repayment plans that are so liberal, so easy to deal with, that most people in effect are going to be forgiven loans. That's what a lot of these income repayment programs, which by the way, started not with Biden, started in the Trump administration. So this is not, I'm not making a partisan comment here. I'm just making a statement. And so the environment is not cool for showing enormous forgiveness of loans for students in the country right now. And so I don't expect anything important to happen in the next year unless the Biden administration just does it, which is their approach. But then the courts are starting to weigh in and say, aha, you've gone too far. This is a congressional decision. It's not a executive branch decision making loan. And so you have a constitutional issue here, which I think is a legitimate constitutional issue. How you resolve it is debatable, but it is a legitimate question. So that's where I think the problem lies in the next 12 months.
I think you actually led in very, very nicely into the next topic that we're wanting to get into here. So just to provide some recent context on this particular subject. So the Biden administration announced its intent to forgive about $10,000 in student loans for borrowers with an annual income of less than $125,000. Nebraska and 5 other states challenged this forgiveness program, which went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court actually ruled against the student loans forgiveness program, stating that it exceeded the education system's authority. So you mentioned there, obviously, the Constitution, and that is the Supreme Court's primary function to determine whether law is according with the Constitution or not, whether it's violating certain fundamental precepts to our country. And so I'm just curious, do you have any insights on either this decision in particular, or if you haven't looked into a lot of the details, what potential constitutional factors really went into a ruling like this?
Well, I'm not a lawyer. But I'm a college professor, so I think I'm an expert on everything. So I'll come. I've been in over 200 courtrooms in my lifetime, by the way, because I am an expert witness very frequently on economic issues relating to legal disputes. So I joke with my lawyer friends, I've been in the courtroom more often than you guys have. So there's some truth to it. So I'm not totally lack knowledge on this. My read of the Constitution and of the situation in general is that there has been administrative overreach here. It's by the Biden administration. It's understandable. They're having trouble getting what they want through other means. So, hey, we'll just do it. And I think I think what the Supreme Court has ruled already on this area will be multiplied several times over. The Education Department, as soon as this decision was announced, said, oh, okay, we have a new program that we've come up with, which was changed things a bit, but still ultimately involved we'll use the word loan forgiveness as part of the program. Or we'll have more liberal income repayment programs that have effectively create the situation where a lot of borrowers never have to repay anything. So, I mean, we made the repayment provision so generous. First of all, we will exclude the first, say, $30,000 a year income. We won't even look at it because you need that much money to eat and drink and whatever else you do to live. And so that is for the Biden administration, and particularly people perhaps a bit to the left on the political spectrum. I think that is the way they will continue to go. But I think it's also true that the court will probably stop this again in the future. I mean, the Supreme Court, because of its makeup. And I happen to agree with the Supreme Court on this, but who cares what I think? It's what the Supreme Court thinks. And I think they'll say, you can't do this, you can't do that. So there's where the uncertainty will be the next year or two.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And now I kind of want to retract a little bit and maybe zoom out to the international scale. And maybe get some of your thoughts on, like, insofar as you're aware of it, what other countries have done in this area, whether it seems to be working or not. And so for instance, an OECD comparison from 2017, college costs about $8,000 per year at public universities at the bachelor level in most of those countries. A third of OECD countries in the report, and all countries with a similar economic status to the US, it seems, don't charge for public college at all. And the countries with tuition costs average a little under $4,000 per year at the public level, or over half of what it is in the US. So considering the colleges in many foreign countries play a larger role in alleviating the financial burden of students, like, I suppose, what does this tell you about domestic possibilities here in the US? Do you think that these other countries maybe just have different makeup than the US and this allows them to get away with some of these policies? Do you think that they themselves are on the wrong track and might run into plenty of issues as they're trying to reduce costs to such a great extent?
Yeah, most of the countries in the OECD, particularly the European countries, but it would apply, I would say, it applies to Australia. Australia has a very interesting programs, by the way, in this area. They tend to be more accepting of the government's role in people's affairs. There's a larger welfare state in Europe than there is in the United States, historically and even now. In Sweden, if you lose your job, or in Germany, if you lose your job, you get governmental support, not for 3 months or 6 months like you might in this country, but you can get it for 2 to 3 years. Tuition fees, as you say, in many European countries were zero. Some have moved to the American system, most notably Great Britain. Great Britain 15 years ago was one of these countries with zero or very, very low tuition fees. Now their fees are, somewhat similar to those in the United States. So as the European nations have faced greater challenges with particularly an aging population, the welfare state is killing the European countries. The French, almost had a war over whether we could ask people to work to the age of 64 instead of the age of 62. I feel sorry for the French, so sorry for them. Anyway, just kidding here. So the problems, we have a different environment in the United States. It is a different political environment. There's just no doubt about it. And so the irony of it is Americans were at the forefront at the beginning in the 19th and early 20th century of providing mass public education to the population. We were way ahead of, say, France or Britain or Italy or Australia in 1950, say. And we've now fallen behind. There's a larger percentage of people getting college degrees in some of these other countries than ours. And that is a legitimate issue to worry about, or to ponder at least how to do it. And I don't know that I have the right answer. I can't change the makeup of the American population or its political views very easily. I happen to think that it's worked pretty well in this country by and large over the long haul. We do have, by most indicators, the best higher education system in the world. We still, if you look at the list of the 100 best universities in the world, pick at whatever list you want to pick. Even the Chinese have indexes. By the way, I used to rank colleges and universities for Forbes magazine, so I have experience in this area too. But U.S. out of the top 25, 18 out of the top 25 are American, maybe 4 British and a couple Chinese now, maybe 1 Swiss. That's the top 25. So America has been pretty darn good in providing higher ed in America, but we have used a different model. And it's because of the political environment in America is simply different than that in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I hear this a lot whenever international comparisons are made, especially on issues of, I guess, just general political feasibility, right? If the cultural institutions, practices, outlooks are completely different, then maybe a massive student loan forgiveness problem wouldn't be quite feasible. Of course, some might retort, well, even if it's maybe not feasible in the short term, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not something that shouldn't be advocated for, strived for, etc. And that maybe we need to do a better job of changing this general outlook in America, this almost aversion to taxes and so forth. I mean, that's just a much broader issue. And yeah, we obviously at ONC, we like to hear from a vast array of perspectives in that regard. But I do think it's important to acknowledge, at the very least, those issues of feasibility, especially in the short term. But kind of, I guess going, we've zoomed out a lot to the international level. We've talked a lot about government policy, what that should look like. Maybe going in to slightly a more personal note. So, I myself am a college student. I'm going to Brigham Young University, which is subsidized privately as a religious institution. And in my personal experience, I don't have to worry too much about, very large amounts of student loan debt or anything of that sort. But certainly some of my peers going to other schools do. Certainly in my experience, people going, across state boundaries. And there may be people who require these loans for financial aid reasons, very strongly, and just don't gather the means to pay them off. These are some cases we've noted in our discussion so far. In your experience working so much in this area and being a professor, what advice would you give to students who are facing this general environment? Considerations that they should have as they consider whether to go to college or not, or maybe pursue more expensive options or not at the cost of receiving greater debt?
Well, as an economist, your question is remarkably cool and good, because I just had to testify before the legislature of my own state, Ohio, relating to college workforce development was the topic. And it's interesting that the two things that impact the payoff to students going to college the most seem to be, one is the general perception of the quality of the institution. Is it good or not? BYU, Brigham Young, where you go, is viewed as a good school. And so the students who graduate are better poised at getting jobs than the graduates at some, I don't know if I should name names, but schools with a lesser reputation. But on the other hand, kids who go to Harvard or Stanford or elite private schools have, rightly or wrongly, have a slightly even better reputation than BYU. BYU is, broadly speaking, in the middle of all schools, although I say on the upper end of that continuum. But so there's that. But the other issue is, what do you major in college? What do you do in college? And how long do you take to go through college? The average student does not graduate in 4 years. If you started out with 100 kids going to college, that's freshmen, after 4 years, only about half of them actually get a degree. College is advertised as a 4-year program usually, but 45 out of 100 will have a degree after 4 years. If you stretch that and say, well, let's call it 6 years. Well, then up to 60 out of 100 get degrees. So 40 don't. So 40 out of 100 are all gone already. I mean, they're gone, but they're no longer, they're ex-college, they're college dropouts for all practical purposes. So you already have 40 out of 100 that are dropping out. And then you have students who major in subjects that they no doubt enjoyed majoring in. I have my own granddaughter who's an actress type person. She loves being an actress. She's enjoyed being in the theater. But, how many people in the theater make more than what a person makes at Starbucks? In fact, that's where most of them end up working, as baristas. So there are a lot of factors that enter into the economic benefits of college. And most students are abysmally ignorant of these things when they enter, in spite of the fact that they get advice from high school guidance counselors, and they get propaganda from the colleges, most of which is erroneous, and it shouldn't be permitted, in my opinion. I think certain college people ought to be thrown in jail, but that's a subject for another day. For misleading advertising to students. So more kids probably should be going to trade schools, to 2-year certificated programs, learning how to become computer coders, get a good job working in that moderately high-tech business after maybe an 18-month course in learning how to code computers, and maybe paying, I don't know, $50,000 out to learn that. And there are some, by the way, some of these computer coding schools even have arrangements where you can go for nothing. And again, have one of these income share agreement deals where, hey, we'll teach you how to be a computer coder that can get a good job, but you got to give us 15% of your income for the next 10 years or something like that. So there are these kind of arrangements that are starting to be made, and I think they're kind of cool. I mean, not for everyone, in fact, for relatively few people in that particular field. But I think it's kind of neat that we're starting to look around. Plato allegedly said, I don't think he ever really said it, that necessity is the mother of invention. So I think maybe necessity is forcing us to rethink the models. And necessity is also going to force me to leave you in a minute, Sam, because we have spent an hour in this what for me has been a delightful conversation, but maybe you view as more of a boring monologue. I don't know.
Well, in any case, I think that you've provided a lot of valuable information for me, for our listeners. And I do think, though, it is about time that we close out. So thank you again so much for joining me today. And we look forward to, obviously, any further thoughts that we have from listeners on this subject, any proposals that we might publish on our website dealing with student loan forgiveness that might incorporate some of these insights or considerations we've talked about here today. So thank you again, and have a great day.
Thank you, Sam. I've enjoyed this immensely. Bye-bye.
All right. Now, just to provide some further information for our listeners, you can listen to Allow Us to Explain and our other podcasts on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you happen to get your podcasts. Obviously, if you're listening to this now, you found some way to gain access to that. And you can find Our National Conversation with our website, ournationalconversation.org, on social media at Our National Conversation, on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and our NATL Convo on Twitter. Tune in next week for an episode of Allow Us to Explain, and thanks for listening.
This podcast was brought to you by Our National Conversation, a place where students generate policy solutions to the biggest problems facing America. Join us in freeing political dialogue from hyperpartisanship. To learn more about what you heard today, check us out at ournationalconversation.org. You can also follow us on social media at Our National Conversation to show your support and keep up with our latest efforts.